It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the LG UltraGear 27GR95QE or 27GR95QE-B, with the -B just referring to the fact it has a mainly black rear, whereas some LG models have a mainly white rear, -W. As usual for a video review, remember that what you see depends on my camera, depends on the processing done by my video editing software, depends on the processing done by YouTube, and ultimately, and very importantly, it depends on the screen that you're actually viewing the video on, so it does not accurately represent what you'd see firsthand using the monitor. This video accompanies a written review, and you can find a link to that in the description of the video. It goes into a lot more technical detail and it covers some areas that this video review doesn't, so well worth checking that out. You can also find information about how you can support the work that we do. Be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, nice way of showing your support. This monitor uses a 26.5-inch LG display QHD, that's 2560 by 1440 or 1440p W OLED panel from LG Display, and it supports a 240Hz refresh rate. So this is a decent pixel density, having this resolution spread across 27-inch-ish screen. So that means you have a decent amount of desktop real estate and a good amount of clarity to suitably high resolution image content. When it comes to text, there are some issues to be aware of, and they are related to the subpixel structure. So I've just put a little image up on the screen. This shows a single dot of red, single dot of white, single dot of blue, and single dot of green in a vertical line on the screen, a macro photograph of that. This shows the order of the subpixels on the monitor. It's red, white, blue, and green. So very different to the usual RGB, red, green, and blue subpixel layout. Many of you will be used to the representation of text using ClearType. This has been used by default in Windows for quite some time. If you want to use that, then you would select the first sample here, which optimizes for RGB. If you select the second, that's a BGR optimization, and that looks particularly weird on this model. However, if you do use ClearType on this monitor, and by the way, the rest of the ClearType wizard, it's just according to your own preferences. If you are using ClearType, there are some fringing to be aware of. This isn't something which I'm going to go through in detail here because it isn't something which I can show you in the video, unfortunately, or not show you accurately on the video. But to my eye, I can see this around the text here. For smaller text, it tends to have a little sort of bright fringe around it. Sensitivity to this kind of thing varies. Not everyone will notice it so readily, but I do notice it, and I notice it more than the fringing on QD OLED monitors. They have their own issues with fringing. For larger text, it tends to look like it's got a sort of displaced shadow. It's a lot fainter than the text itself, but this does create a bit of a weird look. If you disable ClearType, then you won't get that kind of fringing, but things just look weird. You have inconsistent bolding, text just looks weirdly spaced and just generally odd, and certainly not how I'm used to seeing text, so that isn't necessarily a good compromise to make either. There's also fringing observed for colourful elements. For the yellow highlight here, and this is just an example, it doesn't have to be this exact shade and it doesn't have to be white in the background either. You can see this for objects, it isn't just highlights for text, but this can show it quite clearly. There appears to be a red fringe to the left, you might even be able to see that in the video, and a bright cyan fringe to the right. For the turquoise, the same kind of thing. The green text appears to be a black fringe to the left, a bright fringe to the right. It doesn't necessarily look cyan here, but it's just a bright fringe. But I'm not going to go through further examples of this. I would recommend reading the article all about fringing, which covers not just W OLED fringing, but also QD OLED fringing from the website, and there's a link to that in the description of the video. It's also worth mentioning image retention and burn-in. They're two separate issues really. Image retention is more of a temporary thing, and it is something which can be alleviated by using the monitor normally or running its maintenance cycles. Burn-in, that's something which can occur over time, and it's really more of a permanent issue. Actual physical damage to the organic materials used in the OLED panel. I've only used this monitor for a few weeks, and I haven't noticed any image retention or any burn-in, but I can't speak for longer term use of the monitor. It does have some mitigation measures, so it has its own little OLED care menu. The first thing here, screen move, these are all explored in more detail in the OSD video if you're interested, and also in the written review in the image retention section there, so do check those out if you're interested. But just to briefly mention, These modes here, I don't know what exactly the different modes do, how they're different to one another, but the monitor has a little active area around the image. And you can see that in the image here, but there's a bright light shining on the monitor so that you can see this active area. But basically what happens is the screen moves around if you've got the screen move feature enabled. It just slightly nudges it occasionally. It isn't something which happens very often on this monitor. On some monitors with this kind of mode, I would disable it because I just can't stand how often it happens and it's super obnoxious, particularly if you're on the desktop. On this one, it's not too bad. I just leave it enabled. I just selected mode 1 because that works okay for me. But if you do find it annoying, you can disable it. There's screensaver. It will dim the screen after a few minutes of inactivity and eventually it will blank the screen out. Small movements on the screen like the clock changing or a blinking cursor won't stop it activating. So it will do its thing even if you're just on the desktop and nothing much is going on. If you're in a game, you've paused the game, or you're watching video content but you've paused the content, then it could also activate. So it is useful. As a backup though, I would recommend setting Windows to turn your display off after a short period of time. Another reason that's useful is that it will allow the image cleaning and pixel cleaning cycles to run because they will run when the monitor's in standby. They'll also run if you turn the monitor off or try to turn the monitor off. And it'll give you a message on the screen when it's going to run. It won't just take you by surprise and it won't be doing it when you're using the monitor. It's just when it goes into standby or if you try and turn it off using the power button. But the pixel cleaning cycle is the more intensive one. That's after every 500 hours of cumulative use, whereas image cleaning, that takes around 10 minutes. And it will want to do it after 4 hours of cumulative use. But as I said, it'll do it when you're not using the monitor, when it's on standby, or you try to turn it off using the power button. So it's not obtrusive. If you need to turn the monitor back on, you need to use the monitor, you can interrupt the cycle and it will just try and run again the next time it goes into standby or you try and turn it off. And again, if you need to interrupt it again because you're very impatient or you really need to use the monitor, you can do that again. So I do prefer how they implemented the pixel maintenance cycle versus on the Asus where you had to run it manually. But if you want to run it manually on the LG for whatever reason, you can. I wouldn't recommend going crazy and running these a lot manually, especially the pixel cleaning cycle, which is the more thorough cleaning cycle, because it can degrade the organic material. Just a little bit, but if you keep running it a lot, then that can be an issue. But if you do notice a little bit of image retention or something like that and you want to try and get rid of it, the image cleaning cycle, just run that manually. I'm now going to talk about the external features of the monitor. So it has a powder-coated metal stand. I do like a bit of metal on my stand, gives it a nice premium feel, a bit of weight to it. The stand neck is plastic. You'll also notice this shiny lilac coloured protrusion on the bottom bezel. Takes on different tints depending on your lighting and what's reflecting on it really, but it's generally lilac or pale purple. And the monitor has a dual stage bezel design, so you can see that there is a panel border around the image and that's flush with the rest of the screen. There's then a hard plastic outer part. Some people like to call this a borderless design, but I feel that's a little bit misleading because there is definitely a border, a panel border, and you can see that in certain lights, and you can certainly see that when the monitor's switched on. There's also an active area around the image between the panel border and where the image is, which is used for that feature that I discussed a little bit earlier. The screen surface is what I'd classify as medium or relatively light matte anti-glare, so it offers good glare handling. You can see a sort of diffused, slightly sharper than usual reflection there. That's because there's quite strong light striking at that angle. But generally, in a normal viewing environment, you won't have that kind of thing, and you'd usually see any glare heavily diffused like you can see there. So this is stronger and more aggressive, if you like, than most matte screen surfaces used on competing LCD models. And that means that it diffuses the light more heavily, so it's good in terms of its anti-glare properties. But that does have a knock-on effect on the image, which I explore in the contrast section. The stand offers good ergonomic flexibility. You can tilt it, you can swivel it left and right, although the swivel adjustment is reasonably limited, and you can adjust the height. You can also pivot the monitor into portrait. The exact measurements for these adjustments are given in the written review. There are also some other measurements, such as the depth of the monitor. The design's actually quite compact for a 27-inch gaming monitor, really. That is to say that it doesn't take up a lot of depth on the desk, so you can have the screen reasonably close to the wall or closer to the wall than you could with some other designs. And the adjustments as well, it's worth mentioning. I found them generally quite smooth, particularly the height adjustment, a little bit of grab to the other adjustments, but generally you don't really adjust your monitor a lot, you just adjust it and then get on with it. Or if there's another user in your household, you might, for example, adjust the height, and as I said, that was quite a smooth adjustment. I don't always show monitors from the side in my video reviews, but it's worth it in this case, I think, because you can just see how thin the screen is, really slim at thinnest point, but it bulks out centrally where the stand attaches, and it houses a lot of the electronics of the monitor as well. At the rear, a few different materials used. There's a glossy black plastic for the stand base and also used for the central region, although this has a texture to it, so it's not super fingerprint dust magnet there, but at the back of the stand it's just a sort of plain glossy plastic, so it has the potential to attract fingerprint dirt. I'm not generally a fan of glossy plastics, but it's used in a fairly minimal way here. There's also an LG UltraGear logo at the top, and that has the same kind of shiny, slightly lilac look to it, with different colours depending on your lighting and what's being reflected. There's also a little clip-on cable tidy for the stand that just goes in there. It's easy to clip on and off, he says, having never actually attached it in his life. I think it should be fairly straightforward. So that just goes there, and then you can just take it off if you don't want that there. Just a simple routing system. A few other accessories of note, of course, the controller, very important, used for the OSD. There is a little joystick as well, but that doesn't really give you the full functionality or much functionality at all really on the OSD. This is all explored in the OSD video, which is a separate video that accompanies this review. You should be able to find that on the channel, but if not, it is linked to in the written review. There's also a power brick, reasonably chunky design. It's not a half-length design like the ASUS one was, this is a full-length power brick. Oh, by the way, the OSD video also explores the hexagon lighting, so there are two lighting strips running around the rear of the monitor. It's explored in the OSD video if you're interested in that. The ports then, there are two HDMI 2.1 ports, DisplayPort 1.4. There is an optical digital audio output. There are two USB 3.2 Gen 1 ports plus a Type B upstream, and there is a DC power input to connect that power brick I just showed you. There's also a 3.5mm headphone jack compatible with DTS Headphone X, and that's at the bottom of the screen, and that would be on the left side if viewing the monitor from the front. But in terms of the capabilities of the ports, you've got 240Hz at the native QHD resolution via HDMI 2.1 and DisplayPort 1.4. You also get VRR support on both ports, and that means there's HDMI 2.1 VRR, there's adaptive sync via HDMI and DisplayPort, so you can use NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode. You can use AMD FreeSync as well, AMD FreeSync Premium on this model more specifically. So there are plenty of options there, even on models which don't support adaptive sync such as the PS5, you can use HDMI 2.1 VRR. The monitor also has a 4K UHD downsampling mode which runs at up to 120Hz. That's particularly useful for the Xbox Series X, which won't support HDR at the native QHD resolution, but if you're feeding it a 4K UHD signal, it will work, and you can do that up to 120Hz. I'm on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I'm going to talk about the contrast performance of the monitor. This is a definite strength of OLED, especially if you're in a nice dark room as I am now. You can really appreciate the exceptional depth of the dark shades on some content more than others. Of course, it does depend on the content. You can also appreciate how nicely the brighter elements stand out against the darker shades in the background. Speaking of brightness though, this monitor isn't particularly bright. I measured around 200 nits on this monitor. Using my test settings, which target 6500K for the white point, that's a correction that does need to be made on this monitor because out of the box it has a very cool tint. Then it's a little bit lower than that. You can expect maybe 180 nits. This is going to be sufficient for some people. The monitor also has ABL, automatic brightness limiter, and it's very confusing how that works on this monitor. I would highly recommend checking out the contrast and brightness section of the written review for more measurements and more information about the ABL. To keep things simple, that's the kind of expectation, 180 to 200 nits. So it certainly isn't very bright, but it's going to be sufficient for some people. Most people will set their monitor somewhere between 100 and 200 nits for regular SDR use. And that would include in normal daylight conditions, but I do appreciate there are personal preferences and some people will be sitting in a brighter room. In that case, I do appreciate how that can be a bit limited. The ASUS model, for example, that went up to about 250 nits, which isn't very bright compared to most LCDs, but it's still brighter than this LG. So yeah, it will be okay for most people, but not everyone. Anyway, back to the contrast. Excellent gamma consistency, so that means Not only is there really nice depth to the dark shades, it is consistent throughout the screen. So you don't get these variations like you get on LCDs, particularly TN and VA. IPS is pretty consistent in terms of the gamma as well, but on this OLED it is exceptional in that respect. So there are just no shifts when you look at the dark shades comparing different sections of the screen. The gamma on my unit was quite well tuned, but there were some issues at the low end of the curve, so for very dark shades, meaning there was a bit of masking of detail, but this isn't as bad as the black crush you get on VA models. It can also be offset a little bit by using the black stabilizer. You can't set that too high, the black stabilizer setting. I go through that in the best settings video and the OSD video, because there are some artifacts and other issues to be aware of if you do that. But I could set that to 55 on my unit, which was just one up from the default of 50. That does give a little bit of an uplift of this dark detail, and it was actually better than I saw on the Asus, which didn't really have an equivalent feature, which was, let's say, as gentle and specifically targeting the dark shades as the black stabilizer on this LG monitor. So really nice for the depth and atmosphere, and there's no IPS glow or VA glow or any kind of glow you have to worry about. Really very consistent in that respect. The brighter shades, the screen surface, what I would describe as medium or relatively light matte anti-glare. So it is certainly stronger than some matte screen surfaces and very different to a glossy screen surface like the QD OLED monitors use. So there is a bit of what I would call layering in front of the image and a bit of graininess as well, moderate amount of that. So you do become quite aware of the screen surface if you're sensitive to this kind of thing when you're observing brighter content in particular. But not everyone is sensitive to this, not everyone does care. Normally I'd open the curtains at this point and talk about what things look with a bit of daylight flooding the screen, but it's actually the evening now, so I can't do that. But I've got my room lights on, and I've also purposefully made it so there's a little bit of direct light striking the screen surface. And this is just to talk about the effects of the matte anti-glare screen surface when there's light striking it. And there will be some degree of that in most room conditions unless you have the lights off or the only light is coming from behind the monitor. You will get diffused patches of glare, and that floods the image a bit because it's quite heavily diffused on this screen surface. So with a glossy screen surface you would get sharper reflections. They're tighter, and I know some people don't like these reflections, I totally get that. But on matte screen surfaces like this, particularly with effective glare handling, the reason it has effective glare handling is because it's diffusing ambient light. And that light competes with the image and it sort of dulls it a bit, gives a bit of a hazing effect, and some people don't like that. But as I mentioned, some people don't like reflections, or the sharper glare patches that you can get on lighter matte screen surfaces than this. So there's a compromise either way, and that is the compromise that's made here. You can expect diffusion of light across the screen surface. And of course, you just don't really get the same kind of atmosphere, the same kind of depth to the dark shades in these brighter lighting environments, so you don't really get to enjoy the OLED benefits so much. With sort of a bit of brightness in the room, you can appreciate the fact it is an OLED, and even when I compare to VA LCDs, I'm still aware of the fact there isn't any kind of VA glow and the fact that the static contrast is essentially infinite. And speaking of that infinite contrast, I didn't really cover this before. Being an OLED, it has per pixel illumination, so it can completely shut off some pixels or have them extremely dim, whilst others are much brighter, or at whatever level they have to be at. And that means that you get really nice structural detail. As I mentioned, the dark detail is decent, but just in general, you get a nice structure because the shadow detail can be nice and dark. Medium shades have a good depth, a good solidity to them. And that's something which is missing on many LCDs, particularly on LCDs that have relatively weak static contrast. So when you combine that with the consistency, it really does give a very nice, quite 3D look to things, and it just gives a look which LCDs can't replicate. And that's because you've effectively got millions of dimming zones on this OLED screen, so exceptional luminance precision. I'm now on lagom.nl, the website and the test for viewing angles. So the lagom text, that appears quite weird, and that's because of the subpixel issues. So you can see fringing with the text, so the striping is odd. It kind of has a red fringe to the left, the cyan fringe to the right, and that's consistent throughout the text, so it looks colourful and weird. It should look a blended grey. However, this is very consistent throughout the screen, and that indicates an extremely low viewing angle dependency to the gamma curve of the monitor. Solid shades, this one always looks absolutely bizarre on the video, but to the eye it is a consistent purple throughout the screen. Slightly pinkish purple, but not too pink, and it's slightly pinker towards the extreme side edges, just a little bit. And that can be partly a uniformity issue rather than viewing angle specific as well, so that can vary a bit between units. Uniformity, by the way, is explored in more detail in the written review. I also talk about medium shade uniformity, or darker to medium shade uniformity as well. So that is something to be aware of with OLED monitors like this. The red shade here, good consistent rich red throughout the screen, very slightly brighter towards the edges, the extreme edges, but the consistency otherwise is exceptional. A nice consistent saturated green chartreuse throughout the screen. Again, slightly yellower towards the extreme edges. I do say slight because this isn't something that you're going to readily notice unless you're sitting in a completely pitch black room as I am now. The blue block, good consistent royal blue throughout the screen. Again, I can technically see a bit of extra brightness to my eye at the extreme edges of the screen, but again, I'm sitting in a pitch black room and it's still pretty subtle as far as these things go. I'm now on Battlefield 2042 and I'm going to talk about colour reproduction using some in-game examples. I realise this isn't exactly the most colourful map I've picked, but I'll go with it anyway. I think we can work with what we've got here. Now, this monitor has a generous colour gamut which extends far beyond sRGB, and it coincides quite closely with DCI-P3. What that means is for standard content like this, when you're using this gamut which extends far beyond sRGB, you get oversaturation and you get a more vivid look. And that's because the game developers have the sRGB colour space in mind. So using a gamut that's wider than this, you get that extra saturation. To give you an idea of the gamut, I'll just put it up on the screen. So you can see the comparison with DCI-P3 there. It does coincide closely with that. I measured 96% of the DCI-P3 colour space. For those interested, by the way, I measured 91% Adobe RGB. So it doesn't have as much extension in the green to blue region as monitors which fully cover Adobe RGB or come close to that, and that would include the QD OLED monitors. The QD OLEDs have a more generous gamut in the green to blue region and also in the red region, and actually everywhere all around the gamut. And if you're interested in a comparison, please do check out the colour reproduction section of the written review. So what this all means, vibrant look to things. This isn't exactly the best scene for showing a vibrant look to things, but it doesn't matter, I can still talk you through it, and this is just a general thing, it's just something I observe more generally, or you would observe more generally on this monitor. And not just when you're gaming, by the way. Standard sRGB content would be most content you consume on the desktop as well, when you're watching movie content, that kind of thing. So the painted crates here, they look rather vibrant, and although there aren't any natural greens here, the greens do have more pop to them because of the gamut, more pop than they should. That means that some of the greens have a bit of a bright, somewhat yellowish quality. They shouldn't really have, they should look more muted than that. But some of the greens do look nice and deep and lush as well. Things don't go as crazy as they do on monitors with more coverage in that region, so Adobe RGB gamuts, for example, where things can start looking a bit neon, a bit zany, actually. It doesn't go that far. Reds as well. Trying to find some reds, but okay, the fire there, oranges and reds, brought out nice and strongly as well because of the gamut. And if you look at skin tones, you can see that they look a little bit sun-kissed or a little bit too tanned, I guess, a little bit too rich. But it's not extreme, it doesn't look completely sunburnt or anything like that. It's a bit more subdued than on some monitors with a wide gamut. But the fire there, for example, rich reds and oranges and yellows, but the yellows verging on orange, the oranges verging a bit too much on red. But again, it's a vibrant look. The sky blues, this is more of a sky grey on this particular scene, but yeah, there's a little bit of blue sky there. Extra vibrancy there as well, a bit more than intended, a bit less subdued than intended by the developers. But not too bad, not cartoonish as it can look on monitors with an even wider gamut than this. If you prefer things to look more as the developers intend for SDR content like this, then you can turn on the sRGB setting. The monitor has a good sRGB emulation mode, game mode sRGB, And with this, you can adjust the brightness, you can adjust the contrast, you can see that the black stabilizer is grayed out. You can't adjust sharpness or gamma or color temperature, but you can manually adjust the red, green and blue color channels, and that's useful. You can rebalance things there. But anyway, what this does is it clamps the gamut close to sRGB, and this gives a more subdued look overall, but more as the developers intend. So the fire's there, yeah, more subdued, less vibrant, but you don't get the oranges verging on red, the yellows on oranges, etc. The sky blue, more muted as well. The green crates, which I seem to be a few miles away from right now. And just the greens in general, yeah, more muted, more as the developers intend. The monitor also supports hardware calibration, and that is explored in a separate video. And as usual, there are links to all of these videos in the written review if you want to find them, but you should be able to find it on the channel, hopefully. If not, just pop me a comment and I'll link you to that. But the hardware calibration on this monitor, very simple, but it allows you to basically create your own profiles if you've got a compatible colorimeter or similar device, and you can have sRGB emulation with those if you want, or you can customize the gamut. But with the gamut support of this monitor, it does mean that it's good for work within the sRGB color space. It's also good for work within the DCI-P3 color space, but it's not good for work within the Adobe RGB color space. And when I say good for, I mean it has good potential. I'm really talking about the color gamut and the coverage there. So you get good potential within the DCI-P3 color space and sRGB, but not Adobe RGB. I'm going to switch back over to my test settings using the full native gamut, just so you can get a little bit of an appreciation of some of the differences. Again, isn't accurately portrayed on the video, but some relative differences can be seen still. So the gloves there, very different as well. And the earthy browns, again, they have a bit of a red push because of the gamut, which wasn't there using the sRGB setting. And the red of this barrier as well has a lot more pop to it. So there are some red shades here, I just didn't find them before, didn't talk about them so much, apart from that lovely fire over there. But I think you get the idea at this point. This monitor provides a good amount of vibrancy if you want it, but you can subdue things more if you prefer. I'm back on good old Shadow of the Tomb Raider, but I'm running the game under HDR now. I'm using an RTX 3090 for reference. Got it connected via DisplayPort. I've tested with HDMI, very similar. Haven't tested with my AMD GPU yet, but I will give notes as usual in the written review if I notice any differences. I would expect it to be very similar on that though. So I'm going to just jump straight into the figures, the brightness figures. I know that's what many of you like to see. So this very busy looking graph, what it shows are different white patch sizes, percentage of pixels. Some reviewers will refer to this as percentage window, window size, white window, various different things. But what this means with this test, you have a white box in the middle of the screen surrounded by pure black. And the white box either covers 1% of the pixels, 4%, 9%, 25%, 49%, or 100%, which means there won't be any black on the screen in the case of 100%. Some of these lines, I'm just put them in for reference, but you can kind of ignore them because they're not really useful in the real world. First example of that would be the top line there, the sort of medium blue line. That shows the ASUS PG27AQD-M with its 8200K color temperature setting. So that's not very useful. It gives a very cool look. I mean, some people will find it okay, I guess, but it really gives a dodgy balance to things, and it can be visually very fatiguing, especially with the kind of brightnesses you can get under HDR. But it is there to show what kind of brightness is this particular panel, because they use the same panel, the LG and the ASUS is actually capable of. The LG has a similar setting, or an equivalent setting, and that's the purple line, and that is Gamer 2. And when you use Gamer 2, it does boost the brightness because it sets the monitor to a very high color temperature. It's similar to the ASUS. I measured around 9000K on both of them. So the same things I said about the ASUS setting with the high white point applies, but also on the LG you have this really zany oversaturation on that mode as well. They've made things look very weird. And be aware, with all of my testing here, I'm using the latest firmware available on the LG. Also, you will note that I measured up to 910 nits with this weird, useless Gamer 2 setting, which most people aren't going to actually want to use, but still useful for reference, just to be aware of capabilities of the panel, LG versus ASUS and all of that. That is quite a bit higher than some other reviewers will have measured. That's because I have a different test methodology. I use a YouTube HDR brightness test, and I use what I call true peak brightness. So that is the highest brightness recorded at any point during the test for that particular patch size. It isn't just because the monitor peaked at 910 nits very briefly and then went down. It actually could stay at this for quite a while, and I redid the test a few times, and this is what I got. A few of the other reviewers will be using Kalman's pattern generator, which is different. That will take the reading at a very specific point in that test, and for whatever reason the monitor just wasn't peaking that high in that particular test at that point. But you know, it is what it is. Anyway, I would really not pay too much attention to this line. The one I would pay attention to is the navy blue line, the bottom line there, and also the orange line. That gives you a reference. That is the Dell Alienware AW3423DW with its QD OLED ultra-wide panel, and it's using its HDR Peak 1000 or Peak HDR 1000 mode. So basically you can see that the LG does certainly lag behind when it comes to brightness at a sensible setting, which gives the proper calibration and around 6500K white point. And that is comparable to the Alienware, which also has a similar kind of white point, and of course the Asus using its 6500K setting. That isn't to say it's super dim or anything like that, but just comparatively speaking, if you're used to brighter HDR performance, then yeah, it is a bit limited. And I will give some real-world examples of all of this. Also, it can be a little bit confusing if you look at this graph because there's a crossover point. So for example, at a 9% patch size, the LG is actually brighter than the QD OLED. But then it crosses over again by 49%, where bright shades really dominate. And for a full white screen, 100%, the QD OLED is dominant again. But with any of these OLEDs, there is a ABL automatic brightness limiter, which is why the graphs start off much higher than they end up. So that is to say that the screen does dim when brighter shades dominate on the screen. Anyway, I've had enough of that graph. I'm going to go through some particular scenes in games. I will be flicking between a few different scenes and actually a few different games, so apologies if this becomes disorienting, but I think it is helpful to run through various different scenarios when you're talking about HDR. So it's HDR10 that's used. You have 10-bit color processing that enhances your nuanced shade variety. It allows the monitor to put its exceptional luminance precision to good use as well. It allows it to use its generous gamut well. So lots of advantages to the 10-bit color reproduction compared to your standard SDR content, which is almost always 8-bit, and that's really very standard for games under SDR. So it gives you an enhanced nuanced shade variety for these very dark shades, and because of the per pixel illumination, it can show tiny little very dark elements right next to very bright elements, or even just slightly brighter elements, whatever it might be. Excellent precision here. So much better precision than LCDs can give, even if they've got a mini LED backlight. So they would typically have 500 to 2000 dimming zones, whereas this monitor gives you several million dimming zones. So a big difference. And now back on that scene that I showed you when I was talking about contrast and SDR. Under HDR, you get exceptional depth. Now, it really does display pure black or very, very dark shades that are just very slightly brighter than that. And the level of detail is much better actually under HDR as well. The nuanced shade variety helps, and the monitor doesn't have the kind of slight black crush that I mentioned under SDR, under HDR. I mean, there is a little bit there. I'm not saying that it's perfectly displaying every single shade exactly as it should look, but honestly, it is so much better than what I would see in this particular scene and ones like this with this nuanced variety of dark shades than I would see on mini LED solutions. I'm not going to go through it in too much detail, but I do talk about dark biasing when I talk about mini LED monitors, because their dimming zones have to make a compromise where there are mixtures of shades, because although this will look like pure black on the video, there are actually little subtle details which you can see by eye. So the per pixel illumination is really helpful there, being able to display appropriate brightness for those details and appropriate brightness for the really dark shadow detailing as well. And then for the brighter shades as well, again, immediate transition, so I don't see a halo as I'd usually see on mini LEDs around the bright elements there. You can see a halo of light. I mean, that's just my torch that Lara's got, and it will just look like a big ball of light because of the brightness levels. But in practice, there's an excellent immediate transition between the brightness there and the darkness there. Really nice. And the same with the HUD elements. No haloing to worry about there. I'm going to dive into the water. If you've seen my videos before, you'll know I like to show this next little scene here. Again, the per pixel illumination is really helpful. The 10-bit color processing is also helpful. Just going to adjust the camera exposure so I can sort of roughly show you that this isn't just a giant ball of light. There are really nice smooth gradients. Again, you can't see this in the video as you'd see to the eye, but nice smooth gradients, so it can really help where the effects look nice and smooth with natural progressions of shade. And at the same time, nice variety of medium and dark shades. Even the tiny little shadow details there, really nice depth to them, with appropriate depth to the medium shades as well. It's actually very well calibrated under HDR, this monitor, in terms of its shade depths, its PQ curve, if you like to talk about that. I do have to talk about the glint of light on the water, because that is a very bright element in this scene. Now, there is a posterization effect. I mentioned this in the ASUS review. The reason for that is not because the monitor is badly calibrated or anything like that. It is a physical limitation with the subpixels of the monitor. It isn't quite as obvious as it was on the ASUS, and that's because this element isn't quite as bright, because I showed you the brightness isn't as high as the ASUS, and that applies to this particular scene for this element as well. It's not quite as bright. You know, it's a few hundred nits less bright, but it's still pretty bright, pretty eye-catching, especially if you're in a dark room as I am now. So don't think that this monitor looks dull under HDR. Now, of course, people have different experiences, different expectations of this, but it's really so much better than what most LCDs will show you under HDR. I'm not talking about the mini LED solutions here. I'm just talking about your sort of bog standard so-called HDR experience on an LCD. This monitor does give nice bursts of brightness that are far beyond that. And because of the per pixel illumination, it gives really nice depth as well to the surrounding medium shades, the immediate transitions and surrounding dark shades as well, depending on the scene. So that really does help them stand out a bit better than you might expect. But yes, of course, the ASUS does have an edge, and the QD OLED monitors do have an edge in this respect. But anyway, sorry for going off on a bit of a tangent there. The posterization, the reason for this is that the monitor has that white subpixel, that unfiltered white subpixel. And this is used for the brightness of the monitor, and it really dominates under HDR, and it dilutes the image. So very little light is being shone through the red, green and blue subpixels compared to that unfiltered white subpixel. So you look at this element here, you can't see this on the video. I have quite a nice capture actually in the written review if you're interested in the HDR section, just sort of embedded there, where I talk about posterization, showing this exact element. And you can see that it has weird layers to it. Basically it has a bright solid white core, pure white core. Then it has sort of pastel shades of various different colours, sort of different warm shades surrounding it. It should appear much more blended than that, but the problem is that the white subpixel is providing the brightness. The monitor therefore can't provide strong saturation at the same time. I will give some more examples. I was going to say better examples, but different examples of this a little bit later on as well. In fact, why not do that right now? So this scene, I showed you this with the PG27AQ-DM as well, the ASUS OLED monitor. And I did mention a few issues here. The LG does share these issues to some extent, but actually it's a bit better than what I saw on the ASUS. So if I think about this scene as I have seen it on some of the mini LED solutions and also the QD OLEDs, you get this really nice intensity to the red shades and the orange shades. It's because you get that saturation and brightness at the same time. On these WOLED monitors, the LG and the ASUS, you kind of have these pure white elements. It is a warm white, but where it has strong brightness, it doesn't have the saturation at the same time. It isn't necessarily so obvious when you're just looking at the lava here, but where you look at the flames here, and there is another example here, the flames at the top and bottom. Again, you can't see this on the video. I do apologise. It just looks like a giant ball of light because there is a lot of brightness coming out here. It has that white core going on, and the yellows and the oranges, the strongly saturated shades, are not bright. The bright elements are just sort of pure or warm white. With the lava here, it looks better than on the ASUS. I'm just going to adjust the exposure to try and show you a little bit of what I can see. There we go. So on the ASUS, it kind of just looked quite flat and almost pink, quite weird. On this LG, there are some stripes of pure white. They should be more yellow and intense orange than they appear. There should be some bright, slightly red element as well, or rich oranges, reddish oranges. But you don't get that here, but you do get some nice saturated orange and reddish elements combined with brightness, which is this sort of warm white. So it kind of works. It's better than what I saw on the Asus, but isn't quite how it should look. I'm on Battlefield 5 now, and I'm running the game under HDR. This scene here can look super impressive on some mini LED monitors. I like to refer to the Asus PG32UQX as really sort of setting the benchmark for brightness performance and amazing bright scene performance in scenes like this, because it can pump out extreme brightness levels, and it shows that sun and the glints on the icy surfaces there in an amazing way. With the OLED, as I showed you with the numbers earlier in the graph, it can't sustain high brightnesses where there's quite a lot of bright shade being shown on the screen. This is quite mixed. This is nowhere near 100% white window here. I'd say it's roughly half and half bright and darker shade. But either way, it's enough for the ABL to kick in on the monitor, and also it to kick in a variable way. So the sun there is brighter if I have it just a little bit of the sky showing versus if I have a lot of the sky showing. But the difference isn't as noticeable or as abrupt as on the QD OLED monitors. So with the QD OLED models where the ABL is more aggressive, it kicks in more aggressively sooner as bright shades start to dominate. There's really a more noticeable dimming. And because this is starting from a lower base really, there isn't so much of a shift. In a way, the monitor performs kind of well for scenes like this because of the consistency. There are some scenes where the ABL is more notable, and I will talk about that very shortly. But in this particular scene, and quite a few sort of mixed scenes like this, or mixed to brighter scenes, the monitor does pretty well in terms of its consistency. But again, the brightness of those bright elements, it's not exactly exceptional. You know, especially the glints down there, they just really don't stand out in the way they should. And the sun doesn't really have the eye-catching bright look it should have, and I'm in a pitch black room right now, so if you're watching this in daylight or just a little bit of light in the room, then this isn't really going to be very impressive. Not saying it's going to look dull or dim, but just compared to what you can see in some models under HDR. Cyberpunk 2077. So this scene has an excellent mixture of bright and darker shades. It has a sufficient amount of brightness to show the ABL doing its thing, and also because I've got the HUD being shown on the screen, the HUD elements. Remember that the automatic brightness limiter doesn't just cap the brightness, it actually shifts the entire image so it's darker. Speaking of which, by the way, I just realised that you can adjust the brightness under HDR on this. It also doesn't just cap the peak luminance and neatly remap things. It will make things just look dull, kind of washed out in a way, especially if you make extreme adjustments. But the reason they do this is just for viewing comfort reasons. If you find it too bright, set to 100, then you can lower this a bit, just so it's more comfortable, because obviously viewing comfort is extremely important. There's no point in using HDR on the monitor if you're not finding it comfortable. And you'll see that a lot of the rest of this is grayed out. Contrast, gamma, color temp, RGB, all grayed out. You can, however, use VRR at the same time. So you can use adaptive sync, or you can use VRR, HDMI 2.1 VRR, at the same time as HDR on this monitor, and I have actually been using that whilst recording this section of the video. Now, with all that said, the ABL does kick in, but again, you're working from a lower base here. It doesn't go as bright as some of the other monitors, the Asus or the QD OLED monitors. So really the ABL isn't quite as noticeable, but if you look at those HUD elements, you will notice shifts. That's not just the camera. The camera is sort of adjusting a bit as well, but I notice this to my eye quite readily. And that's because there are just small bright elements there, which the monitor is able to pump out really reasonable brightness levels, not extreme brightness levels. You know, this is only ever going 600 nits or so max, unless you're using this horrible Gamer 2 setting. I'm just going to switch over to Gamer 2 actually. Why not? It looks disgustingly icy. There's extreme oversaturation. The yellow text there now looks orange. It's really quite disgusting and disturbing. I have to switch back before I scratch my eyes out, but it has increased the brightness. But either way, where these bright shades dominate, I'm using Gamer 1 by the way again, where these bright shades dominate, ABL kicks in, things are dimmer. Same scene, in the darkness now, in the nighttime. So the neon lights here are reasonable in their brightness, but not as impressive as I saw on QD OLED monitors, and not as bright as I saw on the Asus either. Same with the moon there. It's pretty bright actually, which is why you can see a gigantic ball of light. I'll just adjust the exposure to try and show you. Looks a little bit more like that, but you can also see the details on the moon, the craters and all of that. So it doesn't just look like a giant ball of light. It's pretty bright, but not extremely bright by any means. And some of the neon lights, again, there's a lack of saturation. So the brightness here, I'm just going to have to adjust the exposure again. The lettering there, it looks more pastel than it should. The bluish lights up there as well, they don't have the levels of saturation they should have. And again, this isn't a calibration issue, it is down to the subpixel structure. And those headlights were pretty bright whilst I was getting run over just then. Okay, I think you've made your point, mate. The per pixel illumination as well, the precision there, really nice. No halos to worry about. I mean, there are some halos anyway, just because the game shows them, but the immediacy between sort of these, even these small bright shades in the background and the darker surroundings, really nice to see. Just sort of helps these brighter shades stand out a bit more than you might expect, given the actual brightness levels. So I definitely don't look at this, particularly in a dark room, and think, wow, this is really dim or dull HDR experience. It isn't the case at all. It does have some decent brightness to it, just not as high as some models. I'm back on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, another scene I like to show. I was quite critical about the Asus on this scene. It did show impressive brightness here, and actually the LG does show impressive brightness as well, even though it's not quite as bright as the Asus was. And it does stand out nicely because of the fact that the monitor again has per pixel illumination. There's really nice depth to the darker shades surrounding here. And also really nice detail as well, nice subtle shade variety. Just a really nice 3D look to the rock textures there. Really very impressive look here. And the bright elements show a little bit of that posterization effect, but it's not as extreme as it was on the Asus. It doesn't really jump out at me, to be honest. If I was just not specifically looking for it, if I was just playing this game normally, it wouldn't really jump out at me. It wouldn't be something I'd really notice. I can see it, but it does have a little bit of a sort of silvery blue quality. There's a bit of a purple rim, and it should be a bit more blended. The sort of the bluish purple rim should have a little bit of brighter join with the silvery core, if you like. It's difficult to describe. Anyway, the way it's shown is quite decent, to be honest, on this monitor, so I'm fairly happy with how it's showing that. So definitely better than what I saw on the Asus for this particular scene. I'm on another scene on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I'm going to talk about colour reproduction, because that's another important aspect of HDR. The monitor's generous colour gamut is put to very good use under HDR. I measured 97% of the DCI-P3 colour space, and I'll just put that on the screen quickly just to show you again. So this isn't as generous as the QD OLED monitors, but it does offer good coverage of DCI-P3. And remember that under HDR, the game developers are targeting wider gamuts such as DCI-P3 and ultimately Rec 2020 and even wider gamut. This monitor certainly doesn't offer complete Rec 2020 coverage, by the way, not as much as QD OLED monitors do, which still offer far from complete Rec 2020 coverage. So the QD OLEDs do have higher HDR vibrancy potential, and some of these elements did look more vibrant on the QD OLED. These blue flowers, for example, they had really nice pop to them. And remember, these aren't bright saturated elements, so the issues I was talking about before with the white subpixel aren't the culprit here. It's really more the colour gamut differences. Having said that, there is really quite nice pop. They don't just appear a weird white as you see in the video. They actually do have quite a nice, almost luminous quality to them, but again, not as eye-catching as on the QD OLEDs, but more eye-catching than I saw on the Asus for this particular shade. I'd like to talk a little bit more about the Asus and some comparisons. Now, I mentioned in the written review that some of these green shades, or green shades in general, looked a bit muddy as well, a bit duller than they should. Some of them looked quite vibrant, but some of them just looked a bit out of place. On the LG though, it shows these green shades quite nicely. Again, not quite as lush and vibrant as I've seen on some models with a more generous colour gamut, but really pretty good. I actually about as good as I'd expect given the colour gamut used here. And it doesn't have the issue that the Asus had with some of the shades being dragged down and looking a bit muddy, a bit brownish. Speaking of such shades, the orange and the reddish oranges of some of the dresses here, they're presented really nicely actually on the LG. On the Asus they looked a little bit muddy, and actually some of them looked oversaturated. It kind of depended on the scene and the lighting. Sometimes the Asus showed oranges like this as a bit too red, whereas other oranges weren't as eye-catching as they should be, so a bit weird. As I mentioned in the written review, you're not necessarily going to notice these issues on the Asus when you use it in isolation, but I did do some comparative testing with the LG and the Asus on the same day using the same scenes, and I certainly did pick up on these differences. I've also seen quite a few comments on my own videos and also on Reddit and elsewhere from people who were quite vocal about the Asus colour reproduction. They're not finding it very nice under HDR, but the most vocal complaints seem to be from users of the NVIDIA RTX 40 series. Remember, I'm using an RTX 30 series. There can be some inter-unit variation as well. So I'm not convinced that people were seeing exactly what I was seeing on the Asus. The issues I'm talking about here, yes, there were issues. You know, some shades did certainly look a bit off, but the way that some people describe it as looking completely washed out, that I think that is perhaps a different issue. And I've also noticed that Asus has mentioned in some of their firmware updates making optimizations for the RTX 40 series. So that makes me think that perhaps there is some difference with the RTX 40 series on that particular model. I'm not sure, that's just speculation. And either way, the LG does provide the superior colour performance under HDR. And yes, Asus may be able to tweak that with some firmware updates, and I would really like to see that actually. We're just comparing what I saw on the Asus with this LG. The LG still does have an edge. And this yellowy orange shade here as well, another nice example where the LG just shows a bit of a livelier look to things. And it's not lively as an oversaturated, because remember, the developers are targeting these wider gamuts. It's really just looking as it should. The skin tones as well, suitably toned down. They don't have that oversaturated, overly rich look that you get using the full native gamut under HDR. Neither does Lara with her lovely skin there. So it's really just that the elements that the developers want to look vibrant do look vibrant. Again, not as much vibrancy as I saw on the QD OLEDs and some of the mini LED solutions with a more generous colour gamut than this, but still definitely vibrant and more impressive than what was shown on the Asus. So, I mean, it's kind of difficult to compare the Asus to the LG. Yes, the Asus does have superior brightness under HDR, particularly if you're comparing both models with sensible colour temperature settings, so settings which deliver around 6500K. But the LG has an edge when it comes to colour, and also remember that the higher brightness does invite more of that posterization, which I talked about, and the sapping of saturation, the more pastel look. Both models suffer from that, but because the brightness is even higher on the Asus, you're more likely to see that, and it's more extreme in some cases where it does occur. So I don't really agree with some reviewers when they just say that the Asus is outright better under HDR. It really just depends on what you value in your HDR experience. And either way, I prefer the QD OLED ultra-wide HDR experience, particularly on my AW3423DW, which is very nicely calibrated under HDR. But even so, really what the LG is providing here is just well above average in terms of HDR performance. Back on Battlefield 5, and I'm going to be talking about another real strength of this monitor, and that is responsiveness. This monitor has a 240Hz refresh rate, so it's pumping out up to 4 times as much visual information every second as a 60Hz monitor, or this monitor running at 60Hz, 60 frames a second. So be aware that I'm running this game at 240 frames a second very solidly at the moment, so I'm making the most out of the monitor in terms of its responsiveness. So what this gives is a really nice connected feel that describes the fluidity and the precision you feel when interacting with your character on the game or interacting with the game world. Really nice. And that's also aided by low input lag, because it is important to have low input lag when you're talking about connected feel. This monitor has exceptionally low input lag, I measured just a little bit above 1 millisecond of input lag. I think it was actually around 1.3 milliseconds. It's really a very low level of input lag, really nice low signal delay. That's certainly not something you have to worry about on this model. The other advantage that this high frame rate, high refresh rate combination delivers is that it greatly decreases perceived blur due to eye movement. So perceived blur is something which is explored in detail on an article all about responsiveness, which is linked to in the responsiveness section of the written review. There's also a bit of a summary in the written review, so I would definitely recommend checking that out for some background reading. But you have to consider pixel responses as well when it comes to perceived blur levels, and this monitor is absolutely exceptional in that respect as an OLED monitor. OLED monitors generally are exceptional in this respect. This one is as well. So I'm going to show you some pursuit photographs using Test UFO. There's a comparison with the PG27AQDM, very similar performance with the two models. And there's also a reference display, the Gigabyte Aorus FI27QX, which is a fairly fast IPS model. And you can see a definite difference in clarity when you look at the main UFO itself. With the OLED, the pixel responses are so strong that even the small details like the little white notches on the UFO body are countable. And actually to the eye, they're even sharper than they appear in the image. Same with the segmentation, it's really distinct, and to the eye even more distinct than it appears in the image, so really impressive in that respect. And also if you look at the trailing behind the UFO, there's what I would call powdery trailing, a little bit of powdery trailing for the Gigabyte Aorus. It's not terrible, this isn't smeary trailing or anything like that, but you can still see it, whereas it is absent on the OLED monitors, including this LG. There's also no perceivable overshoot on the LG. This may come as a surprise to some of you, and that's because some reviewers who were testing the original firmware will have talked about overshoot on the LG. OLED monitors shouldn't have issues with overshoot. There's absolutely no reason that they would have overshoot unless the manufacturer's gone a bit crazy and tried to drive down the response times from excellent to exceptionally excellent, perhaps so they stand out in tests. However, it seems that one of the so-called bug fixes which LG has performed with the newer firmware, or the quality improvements, or whatever it is that they've classified this as, they've basically eliminated any perceivable overshoot. This isn't just at 240 Hz, it is at any refresh rate. So you can see some pursuit photographs at lower refresh rates in the written review, and even at 60 Hz, there's no overshoot to speak of on this model with the new firmware. So I'm really pleased to see that they've made that change. There's not really too much more to say in this scene. It's mainly bright to medium shades here, but there are some dark shades mixed in. But regardless of the shades, just a really excellent 240 Hz visual fluidity and felt fluidity. Even small texture details maintain much better sharpness than you would see on an LCD using its normal sample and hold operation. So no strobe backlights going on here and no pixel strobing, nothing like that. This monitor doesn't actually support that. But I think many people, including competitive gamers, are actually going to be very happy with the 240 Hz sample and hold performance that this model provides. Coming back to some of those minor details, the brighter shades, even very fast TN models, even ones with a higher refresh rate than this, like the BenQ Zowie XL2566K, that shows some relative weaknesses for some pixel transitions, including those with bright shades. So you get some extra perceived blur where those little details are present, which isn't present on this OLED monitor. And you also have overshoot to contend with. In some scenes there's a moderate amount of that. Not a huge amount on the BenQ if you're using optimal settings, but still some. And it's just something which you don't have to worry about at all on this model. I'm on another scene on Battlefield 5, and this one is one I like to use when I'm testing LCDs because it shows more dark transitions, so lots of dark shades mixed in, and it shows plenty of transitions which LCDs will struggle with. Even fast LCDs will have some slight weaknesses, but VA models in particular, you're going to be seeing smeary trailing and that kind of thing. But this monitor with its exceptionally fast OLED panel doesn't have any issues at all. Anything you see in the video is really just from the video, but to the eye there's just nothing that stands out at all in terms of perceivable weaknesses. The monitor also supports VRR, variable refresh rate. It supports that via adaptive sync and also HDMI 2.1 VRR, so you can use that on the PS5, you can use that on the Xbox Series X, you You can use that with an AMD GPU and an NVIDIA GPU, so lots of options here with VRR. I'm using an NVIDIA RTX 3090 at the moment, connected via DisplayPort, so I'm using adaptive sync, but I tested with HDMI 2.1, I tested AMD FreeSync, very similar experience on all of these, and it certainly did its thing, gets rid of tearing and stuttering from frame and refresh rate mismatches. Range of operation on this monitor is, well, it's claimed to be 48 to 240 Hz, but I kind of found that it activated a bit above 48 Hz sometimes. It just sort of depends on the fluctuations that are occurring, but only a little bit higher, and I wouldn't really worry too much about this. It doesn't make a huge difference. Something to be aware of on this monitor is VRR flickering. So this test here causes significant fluctuations in frame rate, which will cause significant fluctuations in refresh rate when you've got VRR active. And I can see flickering. It's not throughout the image, it's just for the darker to medium dark shades. And the reason for this is that OLED monitors like this have exceptionally strong contrast, and there are slight gamma changes which occur for dark shades, and you can see this flickering. It's something which you will see on VA models because of their relatively strong contrast, and on VA models they'll typically have so much of this flickering actually that you'll see it throughout the image, but OLED monitors do, I'm afraid, suffer from this because of these slight gamma changes during refresh rate fluctuations. Overall, the level of VRR flickering here, it was similar to what I saw on the Asus, and that is a bit higher than what I saw on the Dell Alienware AW3423DW. That has a G-Sync module, and it seems that there was at least some degree of gamma compensation perhaps that's going on there. But either way, if you're sensitive to this, then it can be an issue on either model, but it was a bit better on the Alienware versus on the W OLED monitors, and also compared to the Adaptive Sync QD OLED monitors based on what users have told me. It isn't something that you always notice, it does depend on the fluctuations. You can notice it most readily in game menus, or some game menus, some loading screens, that kind of thing. They can cause significant fluctuations in frame rate, which translate to significant fluctuations in refresh rate, which trigger this VRR flickering behavior. Let's compare that to some VA models which show this when the frame rate's very stable. And again, it shows it throughout the screen. So it isn't anywhere near as obnoxious as that, but you can see it from time to time. Even on my RTX 3090, I get some dips in frame rate every now and then, and I can see the VRR flickering. It's just something that bothers some people. Other people don't really notice or don't really care about it. It's just one of those things. Anyway, I've got the game running at 175 frames a second now. The reason for that is because I was talking about those QD OLED ultra-wides, and the highest refresh rate of them so far is 175 Hz. And I do notice a drop-off in connected feel, an increase in perceived blur, but the monitor is doing its thing to get rid of tearing and stuttering from frame and refresh rate mismatches. It doesn't get rid of all forms of stuttering, by the way. There can be stuttering from other reasons other than frame and refresh rate mismatches, and being an OLED monitor and there being very little perceived blur to sort of mask this stuttering, it can be a bit more noticeable. And I also mention when I review models with G-Sync modules like the Alienware AW3423DW that there's less micro stuttering. Anecdotal, it's hard to test and scientifically show, but it is something which I do notice, and I know that some others have noticed as well. Most users aren't going to notice this level of stuttering, this very slight amount of stuttering in places. It's really much more slight than the stuttering you would get without using VRR when the frame rate departs from the refresh rate, or the tearing if you had VSync disabled. Down now to 120 frames a second, 120 Hz. Now, I do notice again drop off in connected feel and an increase in perceived blur, exactly as I'd expect. And I notice that even compared to 175 Hz, certainly compared to 240 Hz. But the monitor is again performing flawlessly when it comes to its pixel responses, so it is really giving you a very much optimal sample and hold 120 Hz experience. And remember that as a games console user, you're going to be limited to a maximum of 120 Hz. It's not a bad experience by any means, but I do feel that to get the most out of this monitor, you would have to be running it on a PC, which can push nice high frame rates and refresh rates. Overshoot again isn't an issue, as it seemed to be on the original firmware of this monitor. No perceivable overshoot. 60 Hz now. Really nasty connected feel, especially compared to 240, but really just compared to anything in the triple digits. A huge drop off in connected feel and a significant increase in perceived blur. However, No issues with overshoot. Yay! So you don't have to worry about variable overdrive, you don't have to worry about overdrive settings with this monitor being an OLED. And again, you might see what looks like overshoot in the video, but that's really just artifacts in the video. And I'm not saying that this monitor is entirely free of overshoot, completely free of overshoot. If you measured the pixel responses, you might find some overshoot for some pixel transitions, but it is really very slight and is not something which you will perceive by eye. Even if you're sensitive to overshoot, you're very unlikely to notice this. And it's much better than with the original firmware, where even with the UFO motion test for ghosting, reviewers were quite clearly able to show overshoot with the monitor set to 120Hz or set to 60Hz. If you look at the written review where I test the new firmware with this monitor, you can't see any of that. And just the final thing to be aware of, LFC, low frame rate compensation, is supported on this monitor. So when it goes below its hardware floor of operation, which is around 48Hz or a little bit higher, the monitor will stick to a multiple of the frame rate with its refresh rate. So let's say the game was running at 36 frames a second, the monitor could be running at 72Hz, and that gets rid of tearing and stuttering. However, when the boundary is crossed in either direction, there's a momentary stuttering. It's fairly subtle, less subtle because this is an OLED and it has very little perceived blur due to eye movement, less subtle than it can be, but it's still subtle and it's not something that everyone's going to actually notice. But I can notice it, and people who are sensitive to that kind of thing will notice it. So if you're frequently passing that boundary, it can be kind of annoying, but otherwise it's really not something I'd worry about. To wrap up then, in terms of styling, fairly sort of sensible styling, not too gamery. The bottom bar on the bottom bezel, that lilac bottom bar, looks a little bit like kind of wrapping paper effect. It's a bit glossy. I suppose that's the most eye-catching element. Won't be to everyone's taste, but generally not too annoying. I like the coated metal stand base as well. Nice solid feel to that. Pretty good ergonomic flexibility to the screen as well. A nice slim profile from the side. It has that hexagon lighting feature, which is really quite gimmicky. I've actually got it turned on at the moment. You might not even be able to see this very much in the video. It just gives a little gentle glow behind the monitor. I explore this more in the OSD video. It just gives a little bit of ambience, but it certainly isn't enough to improve viewing comfort or act as a bias light. And speaking of the OSD, I do like the remote. I found it intuitive, easy to use. I do like it when monitors have remotes actually, as I spend a lot of time in the OSD. However, I don't like the way that they've cut down the OSD so much with the joystick, because you might misplace the remote, it might break, you might lose the batteries, then you have to wait for your new remote or new batteries to arrive. There could be some downtime while you're unable to access the full OSD. The on-screen control software gives you a little bit more flexibility there than the joystick does. Being an OLED, of course, understandable burn-in and image retention concerns, not something I can really cover any more than I already have, to say that I haven't had any particular issues during my time with the monitor. I do actually intend to keep this monitor longer term, so I will be doing some longer term testing with it, but I'll mainly be using my Alienware AW3423DW, because, spoiler alert, I do just personally prefer that. It just kind of hits the spot a bit more for me and the kind of things I use the monitor for myself. And that does include quite a bit of productivity, and I did find the WOLED fringing more annoying than the QD OLED fringing. This is subjective, and again, refer to the article linked to in the video description for more about the fringing on both of these OLED panel types. In terms of the contrast, again, thinking about productivity, the brightness is quite limited under SDR. There's also ABL, automatic brightness limiter. There's also something called CPC, convex power control, which is a feature which is always on this monitor, it seems. I talk about that in the written review with respect to uniformity. I would definitely recommend checking out the brightness section for more background reading. It's not something I'd worry about too much, especially when you're using this monitor mainly for gaming and entertainment purposes. But if you're spending a lot of time on the desktop, the fringing, the potentially limited brightness if you're someone who likes a bit more brightness, and this convex power control, which basically causes the monitor to dim a bit at the edges versus the center, it does introduce some uniformity issues where bright shades dominate when you're on the desktop under SDR. It's a bit weird. It's something I noticed because I've used OLEDs before and they're usually very strong when it comes to brightness uniformity. It's just something to be aware of. Again, check out the brightness and contrast section of the written review. but the contrast performance overall really strong on this monitor. The usual OLED benefits there. The matte screen surface, yes, it's divisive, won't be to everyone's taste, but some people will really get on with it and will really like it. In terms of the colour reproduction, good generous colour gamut covering DCI-P3 very well. No extension beyond DCI-P3 really, so lacking in terms of Adobe RGB coverage if you're interested in using that for creative purposes, or you like an even wider colour gamut than DCI-P3, then just be aware of that limitation. I also like the hardware calibration functionality, and that's something which this monitor offers which its competitors don't, and that's explored in a separate video. That's quite a nice little feature, I actually quite like to see that. But if you don't have a colorimeter or you're not interested in hardware calibration, then the sRGB mode of the monitor gives a nice cut down representation of things. It has good flexibility, actually better than most sRGB emulation settings because you can adjust the color channels. The HDR performance of the monitor can kind of be split into two parts really. Brightness, pretty limited compared to some competing models, but I wouldn't say it's terrible. I wouldn't say it's dim. I'd say that it can give some nice bursts of brightness. Again, where bright shades dominate, as usual for OLEDs, ABL kicks in pretty aggressively. Does dim things, it does limit its bright scene performance, but the fluctuations weren't massive because you're starting from a lower base and the monitor can pump out decent brightness where bright shades start to dominate, actually better than QD OLEDs in that respect. So not too bad really in terms of its brightness, but not as good as the Asus alternative. Then again, it does have limitations because of the unfiltered white subpixel, the posterization I mentioned, and the inability to show bright and saturated shades at the same time. So it just has saturated shades or bright shades. And because the brightness is even higher on the Asus, this is actually more noticeable, but it's still an issue on both models. The other side of the equation, of course, is color performance, and I was actually really pretty happy with the LG in that respect. Color gamut, again, not as generous if you look at the Rec 2020 coverage as some offerings, and again, the bright saturated shades aren't there, but overall saturation is there, and good overall vibrant representation, but not overdone either. And the colour consistency, exceptional for HDR and SDR, meaning that the vibrancy is really nicely maintained throughout the screen. That also means the gamma consistency, the level of dark detail, if you like, really consistent throughout the screen, but that was better under HDR than SDR. The monitor does have a black stabilizer which can be used under SDR, a feature which is a gamma enhancement, low-end gamma enhancement, which gives a bit of an uplift, but you can't set that too high without some negative consequences, so you have to be kind of careful with that. But even with this set just a little bit higher than default, I did find that the dark detail was uplifted a bit more than on the Asus model, so that was a nice little bonus of the LG, if you like. When it comes to responsiveness, really impressive, 240Hz performance. Also happy to report I didn't have particular issues with overshoot as this monitor used to have with the original firmware. But yes, exceptional pixel responsiveness, really very low input lag. So if your uses include some competitive gaming, or if you just like to do well when you're gaming, this monitor could offer a pleasing experience for you. Now, the monitor's VRR support, adaptive sync, and HDMI 2.1 VRR offers good flexibility, but there is VRR flickering regardless of what kind of VRR you're using. Some people won't mind this flickering though, and they'll still really enjoy the VRR experience offered here. No pixel strobing mode or no BFI, black frame insertion on this, just a sample and hold experience. So overall, I do think that this monitor has a lot to offer, particularly when it comes to gaming, a bit more competitively, or gaming where you like to do well. It doesn't have to be super competitive, and where that's mixed with other use, I think it can offer a nice experience. The HDR was well above average as far as HDR goes on monitors. Certainly not the brightest I've seen, not the dimmest I've seen either. The colours, pretty good in that respect, not as good as I saw on QD OLEDs. And for me, I was drawing a lot of comparisons either mentally or in the review itself between QD OLEDs and the W OLEDs. And as I mentioned in the Asus review, this isn't something that I can show you in a video. Even if I record the video in HDR and happen to show the video in HDR, it just does not accurately show the differences you see in person. So it's really something I just have to describe. But for me, the QD OLED experience, because it doesn't have that unfiltered white subpixel, I don't find the fringing as obnoxious. I personally quite like ultra-wides as well. I'm personally a fan of high pixel density, so I actually quite like 4K UHD resolutions, but that's just not an option in this segment at the moment. So I kind of just side towards the QD OLEDs, and I also prefer their screen surface, just a personal thing. But on the flip side, I do really like the 240Hz OLED experience. That really is quite special. but just weighing everything up for myself and how I use the monitor. I spend a lot of time with productivity. I do like to enjoy immersive gaming. I do enjoy HDR. And for me, the QD OLED experience of my AW3423DW, I just preferred it. But again, very subjective. And when you compare the LG to the Asus, they kind of have their own strengths and weaknesses. And I will link to a post in the description which compares the two models, which I've got on my forum. Quite a few points of comparison, more than you might think. I mean, there are some obvious things like the fact that the LG has full HDMI 2.1 support, hardware calibration as well, which is quite nice. The Asus has the higher HDR brightness going for it, but at least based on what I tested and the firmware I've used, the LG is the better calibrated in terms of its colours under HDR. And when these models are pumping out high brightness, the OLED monitors, they're not showing strong saturation at the same time. Not everyone likes strong brightness under HDR, or they don't like extreme brightness under HDR. So for some people, the experience that the LG provides will actually really hit the spot. So that's really all there is to the LG UltraGear 27GR95QE or 27GR95QE-B. Be sure to check out the full review on PCmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. Also be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, a nice way of showing your support.